Chapter 10 The King's Closet at the Tuileries. We will leave Villefort on the road to Paris, travelling, thanks to trebled fees, with all speed, and passing through 2 or 3 apartments, enter at the Tuileries the little room with the arched window, so well known as having been the favourite closet of Napoleon and Louis XVIII, and now of Louis Philippe. There, seated before a walnut table he had brought with him from Hartwell, and to which, from one of those fancies not uncommon to great people, he was particularly attached, the king, Louis XVIII, was carelessly listening to a man of 50 or 52 years of age, with grey hair, aristocratic bearing, and exceedingly gentlemanly attire, and meanwhile making a marginal note in a volume of Gryphius's rather inaccurate but much sought-after edition of Horace, a work which was much indebted to the sagacious observations of the philosophical monarch. "You say, sir," said the king, "that I am exceedingly disquieted, sire." "Really? Have you had a vision of the 7 fat kine and the 7 lean kine?" "No, sire, for that would only betoken for us 7 years of plenty and 7 years of scarcity, and with a king as full of foresight as your majesty, scarcity is not a thing to be feared." "Then of what other scourge are you afraid, my dear Blacas?" "Sire, I have every reason to believe that a storm is brewing in the south." "Well, my dear Duke," replied Louis XVIII, "I think you are wrongly informed, and know positively that, on the contrary, it is very fine weather in that direction." Man of ability as he was, Louis XVIII liked a pleasant jest. "Sire," continued M. de Blacas, "if it only be to reassure a faithful servant, will your majesty send into Languedoc, Provence, and Dauphine trusty men, who will bring you back a faithful report as to the feeling in these 3 provinces?" "Canonis surdis," replied the king, continuing the annotations in his Horace. "Sire," replied the courtier, laughing, in order that he might seem to comprehend the quotation, "your majesty may be perfectly right in relying on the good feeling of France, but I fear I am not altogether wrong in dreading some desperate attempt." "By whom? By Bonaparte, or at least by his adherents." "My dear Blacas," said the king, "you with your alarms prevent me from working." "And you, sire, prevent me from sleeping with your security." "Wait, my dear sir, wait a moment, for I have such a delightful note on the pastor quum traheret. Wait, and I will listen to you afterwards." There was a brief pause, during which Louis XVIII wrote, in a hand as small as possible, another note on the margin of his Horace, and then looking at the Duke with an air of a man who thinks he has an idea of his own, while he is only commenting upon the idea of another, said, "Go on, my dear Duke, go on, I listen." "Sire," said Blacas, who had for a moment the hope of sacrificing Villefort to his own profit, "I am compelled to tell you that these are not mere rumors destitute of foundation which thus disquiet me, but a serious-minded man, deserving all my confidence, and charged by me to watch over the south," the Duke hesitated as he pronounced these words, "has arrived by post to tell me that a great peril threatens the king, and so I hasten to you, sire." "Maledustis savi domum," continued Louis XVIII, still annotating. "Does your majesty wish me to drop the subject?" "By no means, my dear Duke, but just stretch out your hand." "Which?" "Whichever you please. There, to the left." "Here, sire?" "I tell you to the left, and you are looking to the right. I mean on my left. Yes, there. You will find yesterday's report of the Minister of Police. But here is Monsieur d'André himself." And Monsieur d'André, announced by the chamberlain in waiting, entered. "Come in," said Louis XVIII, with repressed smile. "Come in, Baron, and tell the Duke all you know. The latest news of Monsieur de Bonaparte. Do not conceal anything, however serious. Let us see. The island of Elba is a volcano, and we may expect to have issuing thence flaming and bristling war. Bella, horrida bella." Monsieur d'André leaned very respectfully on the back of a chair with his 2 hands, and said, "Has your majesty perused yesterday's report?" "But tell the Duke himself, who cannot find anything, what the report contains. Give him the particulars of what the usurper is doing in his islet." "Monsieur," said the Baron to the Duke, all the servants of his Majesty must approve of the latest intelligence which we have from the island of Elba. Bonaparte," M. d'Andre looked at Louis XVIII., who, employed in writing a note, did not even raise his head. "Bonaparte," continued the Baron, "is mortally wearied, and passes whole days in watching his miners at work at Porto Longone." "And scratches himself for amusement," added the King. "Scratches himself?" inquired the Duke. "What does your Majesty mean?" "Yes, indeed, my dear Duke. Did you forget that this great man, this hero, this demigod, is attacked with a malady of the skin which worries him to death? Prurigo? And moreover, my dear Duke," continued the Minister of Police, "we are almost assured that, in a very short time, the usurper will be insane." "Insane?" "Raving mad. His head becomes weaker. Sometimes he weeps bitterly, sometimes laughs boisterously. At other times he passes hours on the seashore, flinging stones in the water, and when the flint makes duck and drake 5 or 6 times, he appears as delighted as if he had gained another Marengo or Austerlitz. Now you must agree that these are indubitable symptoms of insanity." "Or of wisdom, my dear Baron, or of wisdom," said Louis XVIII., laughing. "The greatest captains of antiquity amused themselves by casting pebbles into the ocean. See Plutarch's life of Scipio Africanus." M. de Blacas pondered deeply between the confident monarch and the truthful minister. Villefort, who did not choose to reveal the whole secret, lest another should reap all the benefit of the disclosure, had yet communicated enough to cause him the greatest uneasiness. "Well, well, d'Andre," said Louis XVIII., "Blacas is not yet convinced. Let us proceed, therefore, to the usurper's conversion." The Minister of Police bowed. "The usurper's conversion," murmured the Duke, looking at the King and d'Andre, who spoke alternately, like Virgil's shepherds. "The usurper converted?" "Decidedly, my dear Duke." "In what way converted?" "To good principles. Tell him all about it, Baron." "Why, this is the way of it," said the Minister, with the gravest air in the world. "Napoleon lately had a review, and as 2 or 3 of his old veterans expressed a desire to return to France, he gave them their dismissal, and exhorted them to serve the good king. These were his own words, of that I am certain." "Well, Blacas, what do you think of this?" inquired the King triumphantly, and pausing for a moment from the voluminous Goliath before him. "I say, sire, that the Minister of Police is greatly deceived, or I am, and as it is impossible it can be the Minister of Police, as he has the guardianship of the safety and honor of your Majesty, it is probable that I am in error. However, sire, if I might advise, your Majesty will interrogate the person of whom I spoke to you, and I will urge your Majesty to do him this honor." "Most willingly, Duke. Under your auspices I will receive any person you please, but you must not expect me to be too confiding. Baron, have you any report more recent than this dated the 20th February? This is the 4th of March." "No, sire, but I am hourly expecting one. It may have arrived since I left my office." "Go thither, and if there be none, well, well," continued Louis XVIII., "make one. That is the usual way, is it not?" And the King laughed facetiously. "Oh, sire," replied the Minister, "we have no occasion to invent any. Every day our desks are loaded with most circumstantial denunciations, coming from hosts of people who hope for some return for services which they seek to render, but cannot. They trust to fortune, and rely upon some unexpected event in some way to justify their predictions." "Well, sir, go," said Louis XVIII., "and remember that I am waiting for you." "I will but go and return, sire. I shall be back in 10 minutes." "And I, sire," said M. de Blacas, "will go and find my messenger." "Wait, sir, wait," said Louis XVIII. "Really, M. de Blacas, I must change your armorial bearings. I will give you an eagle with outstretched wings, holding in its claws a prey which tries in vain to escape, and bearing this device: Tenax." "Sire, I listen," said de Blacas, biting his nails with impatience. "I wish to consult you on this passage, Molli fugien angelitu. You know it refers to a stag flying from a wolf. Are you not a sportsman and a great wolf hunter? Well, then, what do you think of the Molli angelitu?" "Admirable, sire, but my messenger is like the stag you refer to. for he has posted 220 leagues in scarcely 3 days. Which is undergoing great fatigue and anxiety, my dear Duke, when we have a telegraph which transmits messages in 3 or 4 hours, and that without getting in the least out of breath. Ah, sire, you recompense but badly this poor young man, who has come so far, and with so much ardor, to give your Majesty useful information. If only for the sake of Monsieur de Selvieux, who recommends him to me, I entreat your Majesty to receive him graciously. Monsieur de Selvieux, my brother's chamberlain? Yes, sire. He is at Marseilles, and writes me thence. Does he speak to you of this conspiracy? No, but strongly recommends Monsieur de Villefort, and begs me to present him to your Majesty. Monsieur de Villefort! Cried the king. Is the messenger's name Monsieur de Villefort? Yes, sire. And he comes from Marseilles? In person. Why did you not mention his name at once? Replied the king, betraying some uneasiness. Sire, I thought his name was unknown to your Majesty. No, no, Blacas, he is a man of strong and elevated understanding, ambitious, too, and pardieu, you know his father's name. His father? Yes, Noirtier. Noirtier, the Girondin? Noirtier, the senator? He himself. And your Majesty has employed the son of such a man? Blacas, my friend, you have but limited comprehension. I told you Villefort was ambitious, and to attain this ambition, Villefort would sacrifice everything, even his father. Then, sire, may I present him? This instant, Duke. Where is he? Waiting below in my carriage. Seek him at once. I hasten to do so. The Duke left the royal presence with the speed of a young man. His really sincere royalism made him youthful again. Louis XVIII remained alone, and turning his eyes on his half-opened Horace, muttered, Justum et tenacem propositi verum. Monsieur de Blacas returned as speedily as he had departed, but in the antechamber he was forced to appeal to the king's authority. Villefort's dusty garb, his costume, which was not of courtly cut, excited the susceptibility of Monsieur de Breze, who was all astonishment at finding that this young man had the audacity to enter before the king in such attire. The Duke, however, overcame all difficulties with a word, His Majesty's order, and in spite of the protestations which the master of ceremonies made for the honor of his office and principles, Villefort was introduced. The king was seated in the same place where the Duke had left him. On opening the door, Villefort found himself facing him, and the young magistrate's first impulse was to pause. "Come in, Monsieur de Villefort," said the king. "Come in." Villefort bowed, and advancing a few steps, waited until the king should interrogate him. "Monsieur de Villefort," said Louis XVIII, "the Duc de Blacas assures me you have some interesting information to communicate. Sire, the Duke is right, and I believe your Majesty will think it equally important." "In the first place, and before everything else, sir, is the news as bad in your opinion as I am asked to believe?" "Sire, I believe it to be most urgent, but I hope, by the speed I have used, that it is not irreparable." "Speak as fully as you please, sir," said the king, who began to give way to the emotion which had showed itself in Blacas's face and affected Villefort's voice. "Speak, sir, and pray begin at the beginning. I like order in everything." "Sire," said Villefort, "I will render a faithful report to your Majesty, but I must entreat your forgiveness if my anxiety leads to some obscurity in my language." A glance at the king after this discreet and subtle exordium assured Villefort of the benignity of his august auditor, and he went on. "Sire, I have come as rapidly to Paris as possible to inform your Majesty that I have discovered, in the exercise of my duties, not a commonplace and insignificant plot, such as is every day got up in the lower ranks of the people and in the army, but an actual conspiracy, a storm which menaces no less than your Majesty's throne. Sire, the usurper is arming 3 ships. He meditates some project, which, however mad, is yet, perhaps, terrible. At this moment he will have left Elba, to go whither I know not, but assuredly to attempt a landing either at Naples or on the coast of Tuscany, or perhaps on the shores of France. Your Majesty is well aware that the sovereign of the island of Elba has maintained his relations with Italy and France?" "I am, sir," said the king, much agitated, "and recently we have had information that the Bonapartist clubs have had meetings in the Rue Saint Jacques. But proceed, I beg of you. How did you obtain these details?" "Sire, they are the results of an examination which I have made of a man of Marseilles, whom I have watched for some time, and arrested on the day of my departure. This person, a sailor of turbulent character, and whom I suspected of Bonapartism, has been secretly to the island of Elba. There he saw the Grand Marshal, who charged him with an oral message to a Bonapartist in Paris, whose name I could not extract from him. But this mission was to prepare men's minds for a return. It is the man who says this, sire. A return which will soon occur." "And where is this man?" "In prison, sire." "And the matter seems serious to you?" "So serious, sire, that when the circumstance surprised me in the midst of a family festival, on the very day of my betrothal, I left my bride and friends, postponing everything, that I might hasten to lay at your Majesty's feet the fears which impressed me, and the assurance of my devotion." "True," said Louis XVIII. "Was there not a marriage engagement between you and Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, daughter of one of your Majesty's most faithful servants?" "Yes, yes, but let us talk of this plot, Monsieur de Villefort." "Sire, I fear it is more than a plot. I fear it is a conspiracy." "A conspiracy in these times," said Louis XVIII., smiling, "is a thing very easy to meditate, but more difficult to conduct to an end, inasmuch as, re-established so recently on the throne of our ancestors, we have our eyes open at once upon the past, the present, and the future. For the last 10 months my ministers have redoubled their vigilance in order to watch the shore of the Mediterranean. If Bonaparte landed at Naples, the whole coalition would be on foot before he could even reach Piemonte. If he land in Tuscany, he will be in an unfriendly territory. If he land in France, it must be with a handful of men, and the result of that is easily foretold, execrated as he is by the population. Take courage, sir, but at the same time rely on our royal gratitude." "Ah, here is Monsieur d'Andre," cried the Blacas. At this instant the Minister of Police appeared at the door, pale, trembling, and as if ready to faint. Villefort was about to retire, but Monsieur de Blacas, taking his hand, restrained him. Chapter
11. The Corsican Ogre. At the sight of this agitation, Louis XVIII pushed from him violently the table at which he was sitting. "What ails you, Baron?" he exclaimed. "You appear quite aghast. Has your uneasiness anything to do with what Monsieur de Blacas has told me, and Monsieur de Villefort has just confirmed?" Monsieur Blacas moved suddenly toward the Baron, but the fright of the courtier pleaded for the forbearance of the statesman, and besides, as matters were, it was much more to his advantage that the prefect of police should triumph over him than that he should humiliate the prefect. "Sire," stammered the Baron. "Well, what is it?" answered Louis XVIII. The Minister of Police, giving way to an impulse of despair, was about to throw himself at the feet of Louis, who retreated a step and frowned. "Will you speak?" he said. "Oh, sire, what a dreadful misfortune! I am indeed to be pitied. I can never forgive myself." "Monsieur," said Louis XVIII, "I command you to speak." "Well, sire, the usurper left Elba on the 26th of February, and landed on the 1st of March." "And where? In Italy?" asked the king eagerly. "In France, sire, at a small port near Antibes in the Gulf of Juan." "The usurper landed in France, near Antibes, in the Gulf of Juan, 250 leagues from Paris, on the 1st of March, and you only acquired this information today, the 4th of March? Well, sir, what you tell me is impossible. You must have received a false report, or you have gone mad." "Alas, sire, it is but too true." Louis made a gesture of indescribable anger and alarm, and then drew himself up as if this sudden blow had struck him in the same moment in heart and in countenance. "In France!" he cried. "The usurper in France! And they did not watch over this man. Who knows? They were perhaps in league with him. Oh, sire, exclaimed the Duc de Blacas, Monsieur d'André is not a man to be accused of treason. Sire, we have all been blind, and the Minister of Police has shared this general blindness, that is all. But, said Villefort, and then, suddenly checking himself, he was silent. Then he continued, Your pardon, sire, he said, bowing. My zeal carried me away. Will your Majesty deign to excuse me? Speak, sir. Speak boldly, replied Louis. You alone forewarned us of the evil. Now try to aid us with the remedy. Sire, said Villefort, the usurper is detested in the south, and it seems to me that if he ventured into the south it would be easy to raise Languedoc and Provence against him. Yes, assuredly, replied the minister, but he is advancing by Gap and Sisteron. Advancing? He is advancing, said Louis XVIII. Is he then advancing on Paris? The Minister of Police maintained a silence which was equivalent to a complete avowal. And Dauphine, sir? inquired the king of Villefort. Do you think it's possible to rouse that as well as Provence? Sire, I am sorry to tell your Majesty a cruel fact, but the feeling in Dauphine is quite the reverse of that in Provence or Languedoc. The mountaineers are Bonapartists, sire. Then, murmured Louis, he was well informed. How many men had he with him? I do not know, sire, answered the Minister of Police. What? You do not know? Have you neglected to obtain information on that point? Of course it is of no consequence, he added, with a withering smile. Sire, it was impossible to learn. The dispatch simply stated the fact of the landing and the route taken by the usurper. And how did this dispatch reach you? inquired the king. The minister bowed his head, while a deep color overspread his cheeks. He stammered out, "By the telegraph, sire." Louis XVIII advanced a step, and folded his arms over his chest, as Napoleon would have done. "So, then," he exclaimed, turning pale with anger, 7 conjoined and allied armies overthrew that man. A miracle of heaven replaced me on the throne of my fathers after 25 years of exile. I have, during those 25 years, spared no pains to understand the people of France and the interests which were confided to me. And now, when I see the fruition of my wishes almost within reach, the power I hold in my hands bursts and shatters me to atoms. Sire, it is a fatality, murmured the minister, feeling the pressure of the circumstances, however light a thing to destiny, was too much for any human strength to endure. What our enemies say of us, then, is true. We have learnt nothing, forgotten nothing. If I were betrayed as he was, I would console myself, but to be in the midst of persons elevated by myself to places of honor, who ought to watch over me more carefully than over themselves, for my fortune is theirs. Before me they were nothing, after me they will be nothing, and perish miserably from incapacity, ineptitude. Oh, yes, sir, you are right. It is fatality. The minister quailed before this outburst of sarcasm. Monsieur de Blacas wiped the moisture from his brow. Villefort smiled within himself, for he felt his increased importance. To fall, continued King Louis, who at the first glance had sounded the abyss on which his monarchy hung suspended, to fall, and learn of that fall by telegraph. Oh, I would rather mount the scaffold of my brother Louis XVI than thus descend the staircase at the Tuileries, driven away by ridicule. Ridicule, sir! Why, you know not its power in France, and yet you ought to know it. Sire, "Sire," murmured the minister, "for pity's—" "Approach, Monsieur de Villefort," resumed the king, addressing the young man, who, motionless and breathless, was listening to a conversation upon which depended the destiny of a kingdom. "Approach, and tell monsieur that it is possible to know beforehand all that he has not known." "Sire, it was really impossible to learn the secrets which that man concealed from all the world." "Really impossible?" "Yes, that is a great word, sir. Unfortunately, there are great words, as there are great men. I have measured them. Really impossible for a minister who has an office, agents, spies, and 1,500,000 francs for Secret Service money, to know what is going on at 60 leagues from the coast of France. Well, then, see, here is a gentleman who had none of these resources at his disposal, a gentleman, only a simple magistrate, who has learned more than you with all your police, and would have saved my crown if, like you, he had had the power of directing a telegraph." The look of the minister of police was turned with concentrated spite on Villefort, who bent his head in modest triumph. "I do not mean that for you, Blacas," continued Louis XVIII. "For if you have discovered nothing, at least you have had the good sense to persevere in your suspicions. Any other than yourself would have considered the disclosure of Monsieur de Villefort insignificant, or else dictated by venial ambition." These words were an allusion to the sentiments which the minister of police had uttered with so much confidence an hour before. Villefort understood the king's intent. Any other person would perhaps have been overcome by such an intoxicating draught of praise, but he feared to make for himself the mortal enemy of the police minister, although he saw that d'André was irrevocably lost. In fact, the minister, who in the plenitude of his power had been unable to unearth Napoleon's secret, might, in despair at his own downfall, interrogate Dante's, and so lay bare the motives of Villefort's plot. Realizing this, Villefort came to the rescue of the crestfallen minister, instead of aiding to crush him. "Sire," said Villefort, "the suddenness of this event must prove to your Majesty that the issue is in the hands of Providence. What your Majesty is pleased to attribute to me as profound perspicacity is simply owing to chance, and I have profited by that chance like a good and devoted servant, that's all. Do not attribute to me more than I deserve, sire. Then your Majesty may never have occasion to recall the first opinion you may have been pleased to form of me." The minister of police thanked the young man by an eloquent look, and Villefort understood that he had succeeded in his design. That is to say, that without forfeiting the gratitude of the king, he had made a friend of one whom, in case of necessity, he might rely. "'Tis well," resumed the king. "And now, gentlemen," he continued, turning toward Monsieur de Blacas and the minister of police, "I have no further occasion for you, and you may retire. What now remains to do is in the department of the minister of war." "Fortunately, sire," said Monsieur de Blacas, "we can rely on the army. Your Majesty knows how every report confirms their loyalty and attachment." "Do not mention reports, Duke, to me, for I know now what confidence to place in them. Yet, speaking of reports, Baron, what have you learned with regard to the affair in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "The affair in the Rue Saint-Jacques!" exclaimed Villefort, unable to repress an exclamation. Then, suddenly pausing, he added, "Your pardon, sire, but my devotion to your Majesty has made me forget, not the respect that I have, for it is too deeply engraved in my heart, but the rules of etiquette." Go on, sir," replied the king. "You have today earned the right to make inquiries here." "Sire," interposed the minister of police, "I came a moment ago to give your Majesty fresh information which I had obtained on this head, when your Majesty's attention was attracted by the terrible event that has occurred in the Gulf, and now these facts will cease to interest your Majesty." "On the contrary, sir, on the contrary," said Louis XVIII. "This affair seems to me to have a decided connection with that which occupies our attention, and the death of General Quesnel will, perhaps, put us on the direct track of a great internal conspiracy." At the name of General Quesnel, Villefort trembled. "Everything points to the conclusion, sire," said the Minister of Police. "That death was not the result of suicide, as we first believed, but of assassination. General Quesnel, it appears, has just left a Bonapartist club when he disappeared. An unknown person had been with him that morning, and had made an appointment with him in the Rue Saint-Jacques. Unfortunately, the general's valet, who was dressing his hair at the moment when the stranger entered, heard the street mentioned, but did not catch the number." As the police minister related this to the king, Villefort, who looked as if his very life hung on the speaker's lips, turned alternately red and pale. The king looked towards him. "Do you not think with me, Monsieur de Villefort, that General Quesnel, whom they believed attached to the usurper, but who was really entirely devoted to me, has perished the victim of a Bonapartist ambush?" "It is probable, sire," replied Villefort. "But is this all that is known?" "They are on the track of the man who appointed the meeting with him." "On his track?" said Villefort. "Yes, the servant has given his description. He is a man of from 50 to 52 years of age, dark, with black eyes, covered with shaggy eyebrows, and a thick moustache. He was dressed in a blue frock coat, buttoned up to the chin, and he wore at his buttonhole a rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honor. Yesterday, a person exactly corresponding with this description was followed, but he was lost sight of at the corner of the Rue de la Josienne and the Rue Coqueron." Villefort leaned on the back of an armchair, for, as the Minister of Police went on speaking, he felt his legs bend under him. But when he learned that the unknown had escaped the vigilance of the agent who followed him, he breathed again. "Continue to seek for this man, sir," said the king to the Minister of Police. "For if, as I am all but convinced, General Quesnel, who would have been so useful to us at this moment, has been murdered, his assassins, Bonapartists or not, shall be cruelly punished." It required all of Villefort's coolness not to betray the terror with which this declaration of the king inspired him. "How strange," continued the king with some asperity. "The police think that they have disposed of the whole matter when they say a murder has been committed, and especially so when they can add, 'and we are on the track of the guilty persons.' Sire, your Majesty will, I trust, be amply satisfied on this point at least. We shall see. I will no longer detain you, Monsieur de Villefort, for you must be fatigued after so long a journey. Go and rest. Of course, you stopped at your father's?" A feeling of faintness came over Villefort. "No, sire," he replied. "I alighted at the Hôtel de Madrid in the Rue de Turon." "But you have seen him?" "Sire, I went straight to the Duc de Blacas." "But you will see him, then?" "I think not, sire." "Ah, I forgot," said Louis, smiling in a manner which proved that all these questions were not made without a motive. "I forgot that you and Mr. Noirtier were not on the best terms possible, and that is another sacrifice made to the royal cause, and for which you should be recompensed." "Sir, the kindness your Majesty deigns to evince toward me is a recompense which so far surpasses my utmost ambition that I have nothing more to ask for." "Never mind, sir, we will not forget you. Make your mind easy. In the meanwhile," the king here detached the cross of the Legion of Honor which he usually wore over his blue coat, near the cross of Saint Louis, above the order of Notre Dame du Mont Carmel and Saint Lazare, and gave it to Villefort. "In the meanwhile, take this cross." "Sire," said Villefort, "your Majesty mistakes. This is an officer's cross." "Ma foi," said Louis XVIII., "take it, such as it is, for I have not the time to procure you another. Blacas, Let it be your care to see that the brevet is made out and sent to Monsieur de Villefort." Villefort's eyes were filled with tears of joy and pride. He took the cross and kissed it. "And now," he said, "may I inquire what are the orders with which your Majesty deigns to honor me?" "Take what rest you require, and remember that if you are not able to serve me here in Paris, you may be of the greatest service to me at Marseilles." "Sire," replied Villefort, bowing, "in an hour I shall have quitted Paris." "Go, sir," said the king, "and should I forget you, king's memories are short, do not be afraid to bring yourself to my recollection. Baron, send for the Minister of War. Blacas, remain." "Ah, sir," said the Minister of Police to Villefort, as they left the Tuileries, "you entered by luck's door. Your fortune is made." "Will it be long first?" muttered Villefort, saluting the minister, whose career was ended, and looking about him for a hackney coach. One passed at the moment, which he hailed. He gave his address to the driver, and, springing on, threw himself on the seat, and gave loose to dreams of ambition. 10 minutes afterward, Villefort reached his hotel, ordered horses to be ready in 2 hours, and asked to have his breakfast brought to him. He was about to begin his repast when the sound of the bell rang sharp and loud. The valet opened the door, and Villefort heard someone speak his name. "Who would know that I was here already?" said the young man. The valet entered. "Well," said Villefort, "what is it? Who rang? Who asked for me?" "A stranger who will not send in his name." "A stranger who will not send in his name? What can he want with me?" "He wishes to speak to you."
"To me?"
"Yes."
"Did he mention my name?"
"Yes."
"What sort of a person is he?"
"Why, sir, a man of about 50.
"Short or tall?"
"About your own height, sir."
"Dark or fair?"
"Dark, very dark, with black eyes, black hair, black eyebrows."
"And how dressed?"
asked Villefort quickly. "In a blue frock coat, buttoned up close, decorated with the Legion of Honor."
"It is he,"
said Villefort, turning pale.
"Eh, pardieu," said the individual whose description we have twice given, entering the door. "What a great deal of ceremony! Is it the custom in Marseilles for sons to keep their fathers waiting in their anterooms?" "Father!" cried Villefort, "then I was not deceived. I felt sure it must be you." "Well, then, if you felt so sure," replied the newcomer, putting his cane in a corner and his hat on a chair, "allow me to say, my dear Gerard, that it was not very filial of you to keep me waiting at the door." "Leave us, Germain," said Villefort. The servant quitted the apartment with evident signs of astonishment. So ends Chapter 11. The Corsican Ogre. Chapter 12. Father and Son. Monsieur Noirtier, for it was indeed he who entered, looked after the servant until the door was closed, and then, fearing no doubt that he might be overheard in the antechamber, he opened the door again. Nor was that precaution useless, as appeared from the rapid retreat of Germain, who proved that he was not exempt from the sin which ruined our first parents. Monsieur Noirtier then took the trouble to close and bolt the antechamber door, then that of the bedchamber, and then extended his hand to Villefort, who had followed all his motions with surprise which he could not conceal. "Well, now, my dear Gerard," he said to the young man, with a very significant look, "do you know, you seem as if you were not very glad to see me." "My dear father," said Villefort, "I am, on the contrary, delighted, but I so little expected your visit that it has somewhat overcome me." "But, my dear fellow," replied Monsieur Noirtier, seating himself, "I might say the same thing to you when you announced to me your wedding for the 28th of February, and on the 3rd of March you turn up here in Paris." "And if I have come, my dear father," said Gerard, drawing closer to Monsieur Noirtier, "do not complain, for it is for you that I came, and my journey will be your salvation." "Ah, indeed," said Monsieur Noirtier, stretching himself out at his ease in the chair. "Really, pray tell me all about it, for it must be interesting." "Father, have you heard speak of a certain Bonapartist club in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "Number 53, yes. I am vice president." "Father, your coolness makes me shudder." "Why, my dear boy? When a man has been proscribed by the mountaineers, has escaped from Paris in a hay cart, has been hunted over the plains of Bordeaux by Robespierre's bloodhounds, he becomes accustomed to most things. But go on. What about the club in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "Why, they induced General Quesnel to go there, and General Quesnel, who quitted his own house at 9 o'clock in the evening, was found the next day in the Seine." "And who told you this fine story?" "The king himself." "Well, then, in return for your story," continued Noirtier, "I will tell you another. My dear father, I think I already know what you are about to tell me." "Ah, you have heard of the landing of the Emperor?" "Not so loud, father, I entreat of you, for your own sake as well as mine. Yes, I heard the news, and knew it even before you could, for 3 days ago I posted from Marseilles to Paris with all possible speed, half desperate at the enforced delay." "3 days ago? You are crazy. Why, 3 days ago the Emperor had not yet landed." "No matter, I was aware of his intention." "How did you know about it?" "By a letter addressed to you from the island of Elba." "To me?" "To you, and which I discovered in the pocket-book of the messenger. Had that letter fallen into the hands of another, you, my dear father, would probably ere this have been shot." Villefort's father laughed. "Come, come," said he, "will the Restoration adopt imperial methods so promptly? Shot, my dear boy? What an idea! Where is the letter you speak of? I know you too well to suppose you would allow such a thing to pass you." "I burnt it, for fear that even a fragment should remain, for that letter must have led to your condemnation." "And the destruction of your future prospects," replied Noirtier. "Yes, I can easily comprehend that. But I have nothing to fear while I have you to protect me." "I do better than that, sir. I save you." "You do? Why, really, the thing comes more and more dramatic. Explain yourself." "I must refer again to the club in the Rue Saint-Jacques." "It appears that this club is rather a bore to the police. Why didn't they search more vigilantly? They would have found—" "They have not found, but they are on the track." "Yes, that is the usual phrase. I'm quite familiar with it. When the police is at fault, it declares that it is on the track, and the government patiently awaits the day when it comes to say, with a sneaking air, that the track is lost. Yes, but they have found a corpse. The general has been killed, and in all countries they call that a murder." "A murder, do you call it? Why, there is nothing to prove that the general was murdered. People are found every day in the Seine, having thrown themselves in, or having been drowned from not knowing how to swim." "Father, you know very well that the general was not a man to drown himself in despair, and people do not bathe in the Seine in the month of January. No, no, do not be deceived. There was murder in every sense of the word." "And who thus designated it?" "The king himself." "The king? I thought he was a philosopher enough to allow that there was no murder in politics. In politics, my dear fellow, you know as well as I do, there are no men but ideas, no feelings but interests. In politics we do not kill a man, we only remove an obstacle, that is all. Would you like to know how matters have progressed? Well, I will tell you. It was thought reliance might be placed in General Quesnel. He was recommended to us from the island of Elba. One of us went to him and invited him to the Rue Saint-Jacques, where he would find some friends. He came there, and the plan was unfolded to him for leaving Elba, the projected landing, etc. When he heard and comprehended all to the fullest extent, he replied that he was a royalist. Then all looked at each other. He was made to take an oath, and he did so, but with such an ill grace that it was really tempting Providence to swear him, and yet, in spite of that, the general was allowed to depart free, perfectly free. Yet he did not return home. What could that mean, my dear fellow? That on leaving us he lost his way, that's all? A murder? Really, Villefort, you surprise me. You, a deputy procurer, to have found an accusation on such bad premises. Did I ever say to you, when you were fulfilling your character as a royalist, and cut off the head of one of my party, "My son, you have committed a murder"? No, I said, "Very well, sir. You have gained the victory. Tomorrow, perchance, it will be our turn." "But, father, take care. When our turn comes, our revenge will be sweeping." "I do not understand you. You rely on the usurper's return?" "We do." "You are mistaken. He will not advance 2 leagues into the interior of France without being followed, tracked, and caught like a wild beast." "My dear fellow, the Emperor is at this moment on his way to Grenoble. On the 10th or 12th he will be at Lyons, and on the 20th or 25th at Paris." "The people will rise." "Yes, to go and meet him." "He has but a handful of men with him, and armies will be dispatched against him." "Yes, to escort him to the capital. Really, my dear Gerard, you are but a child. You think yourself well informed because the telegraph has told you 3 days after the landing. The usurper has landed at Cannes with several men he is pursued. But where is he? What is he doing? You do not know at all. And in this way they will chase him to Paris without drawing a trigger. Grenoble and Lyons are faithful cities, and will oppose to him an impassable barrier. Grenoble will open her gates to him with enthusiasm. All Lyons will hasten to welcome him. Believe me, we are as well informed as you, and our police are as good as your own. Would you like proof of it? Well, you wished to conceal your journey from me, and yet I knew of your arrival half an hour after you had passed the barrier. You gave your direction to no one but your postilion, yet I have your address, and in proof I am here, at the very instant you are going to sit at your table. Ring then, if you please, for a second knife, fork, and plate, and we will dine together." "Indeed," replied Villefort, looking at his father with astonishment, "you really do seem to be well informed." "The thing is simple enough. You who are in power have only the means that money produces. We who are in expectation have those which devotion prompts." "Devotion!" said Villefort with a sneer. "Yes, devotion, for that is, I believe, the phrase for hopeful ambition." And Villefort's father extended his hand to the bell-rope to summon the servant whom his son had not called. Villefort caught his arm. "Wait, my dear father," said the young man. "One word more." "Say on." "However stupid the royalist police may be, they do know one terrible thing." "What is that?" "The description of the man who, on the morning of the day when General Quesnel disappeared, presented himself at his house." "Oh, the admirable police have found that out, have they? And what may be that description?" "Dark complexion, hair, eyebrows, and whiskers, black, blue frock coat, buttoned up to the chin, rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honor in his buttonhole, a hat with a wide brim, and a cane." "Ah, that's it, is it?" said Noirtier. "And why, then, have they not laid hands on him?" "Because yesterday or the day before they lost sight of him at the corner of the Rue Coqueron." "Didn't I say that your police were good for nothing?" "Yes, but they may catch him yet." "True," said Noirtier, looking carelessly around him, "true. If this person were not on his guard, as he is," and he added with a smile, "he will consequently make a few changes in his personal appearance." At these words he rose and put off his frock-coat and cravat, went towards a table on which lay his son's toilet articles, lathered his face, took a razor, and with a firm hand cut off the compromising whiskers. Villefort watched him with alarm not devoid of admiration. His whiskers cut off, Noirtier gave another turn to his hair, took, instead of his black cravat, a colored neckerchief which lay at the top of an open portmanteau, put on, in lieu of his blue and high-buttoned frock-coat, a coat of Villefort's of dark brown, and cut away in front, tried on before a glass with the narrow-brimmed hat of his son's, which appeared to fit him perfectly, and, leaving his cane in the corner where he had deposited it,
took up a small bamboo switch, and cut the air with it once or twice, and walked about with that easy swagger which was one of his principal characteristics. "Well," he said, turning toward his wondering son, when the disguise was completed, "well, do you think your police will recognize me now?" "No, father," stammered Villefort. "At least, I hope not." "And now, my dear boy," continued Noirtier, "I rely on your prudence to remove all the things which I leave in your care." "Oh, rely on me," said Villefort. "Yes, yes, and now I believe you are right, and that you have really saved my life. Be assured I will return the favor hereafter." Villefort shook his head. "You are not convinced yet." "I hope, at least, that you may be mistaken." "Shall you see the king again?" "Perhaps." "Would you pass, in his eyes, for a prophet?" "Prophets of evil are not in favor at the court, father." "True, but some day they do them justice, and supposing a second restoration, you would then pass for a great man." "Well, what should I say to the king?" "Say this to him: Sire, you are deceived as to the feeling in France as to the opinions of the towns and the prejudices of the army. He whom in Paris you call the Corsican ogre, who at Nevers is styled the usurper, is already saluted as Bonaparte in Lyons, and Emperor in Grenoble. You think he is tracked, pursued, captured. He is advancing as rapidly as his own eagles. The soldiers you believe to be dying with hunger, worn out with fatigue, ready to desert, gather like atoms of snow about the rolling ball as it hastens forward. Sire, go, leave France to its real master, to him who acquired it not by purchase, but by right of conquest. Go, sire, that you not incur any risk, for your adversary is powerful enough to show you mercy, but because it would be humiliating for a grandson of St. Louis to owe his life to a man of Arcola, Marengo, Austerlitz. Tell him this, Gerard, or rather tell him nothing. Keep your journey a secret. Do not boast of what you have come to Paris to do or have done. Return with all speed. Enter Marseille at night, and your house by the back door, and there remain, quiet, submissive, secret, and above all inoffensive, for this time I swear to you. We shall act like powerful men who know their enemies. Go, my son, go, my dear Gerard, and by your obedience to my paternal orders, or, if you prefer it, friendly counsels, we will keep you in your place. This will be, answered Noirtier with a smile, one means by which you may a second time save me, if the political balance should some day take another turn, and cast you aloft while hurling me down. Adieu, my dear Gerard, and at your next journey alight at my door." Noirtier left the room when he had finished, with the same calmness that had characterized him during the whole of his remarkable and trying conversation. Villefort, pale and agitated, ran to the window, put aside the curtain, and saw him pass, cool and collected, by 2 or 3 ill-looking men at the corner of the street, who were there, perhaps, to arrest a man with black whiskers and a blue frock coat, and a hat with a broad brim. Villefort stood watching, breathless, until his father had disappeared at the Rue Bussy. Then he turned to the various articles he had left behind him, put the black cravat and blue frock coat at the bottom of the portmanteau, threw the hat into a dark closet, broke the cane into small bits, and flung it in the fire, put on his travelling cap, and, calling his valet, checked with a look the 1,000 questions he was ready to ask, paid the bill, sprang into his carriage, which was ready, learned at Lyons that Bonaparte had entered Grenoble, and, in the midst of the tumult which prevailed along the road, at length reached Marseille, a prey to all the hopes and fears which enter into the heart of a man with ambition and its first successes. So ends Chapter 12, Father and Son.
Chapter 13. The 100 Days. Monsieur Noirtier was a true prophet, and things progressed rapidly, as he had predicted. Everyone knows the history of the famous return from Elba, a return which was unprecedented in the past, and will probably remain without a counterpart in the future. Louis XVI made but a faint attempt to parry this unexpected blow. The monarchy he had scarcely reconstructed tottered on its precarious foundation, and at a sign from the emperor the incongruous structure of ancient prejudices and new ideas fell to the ground. Villefort, therefore, gained nothing save the king's gratitude, which was rather likely to injure him at the present time, and the cross of the Legion of Honour, which he had the prudence not to wear, although Monsieur de Blacas had duly forwarded the brevet. Napoleon would doubtless have deprived Villefort of his office had it not been for Noirtier, who was all-powerful at court, and thus the Girondin of '93 and the Senator of 1806 protected him who so lately had been his protector. All Villefort's influence barely enabled him to stifle the secret Dantes had so nearly divulged. The king's procureur alone was deprived of his office, being suspected of royalism. However, scarcely was the imperial power established, that is, scarcely had the emperor re-entered the Tuileries and begun to issue orders from the closet into which we have introduced our readers, he found on the table there Louis XVI's half-filled snuff-box. Scarcely had this occurred when Marseilles began, in spite of the authorities, to rekindle the flames of civil war, always smouldering in the south, and it required but little to excite the populace to acts of far greater violence than the shouts and insults with which they assailed the royalists whenever they ventured abroad. Owing to this change, the worthy shipowner became at that moment, we will not say all-powerful, because Morrel was a prudent and rather a timid man, so much so that many of the most zealous partisans of Bonaparte accused him of moderation, but sufficiently influential to make a demand in favour of Dantes. Villefort retained his place, but his marriage was put off until a more favourable opportunity. If the emperor remained on the throne, Gerard required a different alliance to aid his career. If Louis XVI returned, the influence of Monsieur de Saint-Méran, like his own, could be vastly increased, and the marriage be still more suitable. The deputy procureur was, therefore, the first magistrate of Marseilles, when one morning his door opened and Monsieur Morrel was announced. Anyone else would have hastened to receive him, but Villefort was a man of ability, and he knew this would be a sign of weakness. He made Morrel wait in the antechamber, although he had no one with him, for the simple reason that the king's procureur always makes one wait, and after passing a quarter of an hour in reading the papers, he ordered Monsieur Morrel to be admitted. Morrel expected Villefort would be dejected. He found him as he had found him 6 weeks before, calm, firm, and full of that glacial politeness, that most insurmountable barrier which separates the well-bred from the vulgar man. He had entered Villefort's office expecting that the magistrate would tremble at the sight of him. On the contrary, he felt a cold shudder all over him, when he saw Villefort sitting there with his elbows on his desk, and his head leaning on his hand. He stopped at the door. Villefort gazed at him as if he had some difficulty in recognizing him. Then, after a brief interval, during which the honest shipowner turned his hat in his hand, "Monsieur Morrel, I believe?" said Villefort. "Yes, sir." "Come nearer," said the magistrate, with a patronizing wave of the hand, "and tell me to what circumstance I owe the honour of this visit." "Do you not guess, monsieur?" asked Morrel. "Not in the least, but if I can serve you in any way, I shall be delighted." "Everything depends on you." "Explain yourself, pray." "Monsieur," said Morrel, recovering his assurance as he proceeded, "do you recollect that a few days before the landing of His Majesty the Emperor, I came to intercede for a young man, the mate of my ship, who was accused of being concerned in correspondence with the island of Elba?" What was the other day a crime is to-day a title to favour. You then served Louis XVI, and you did not show any favour. It was your duty. To-day you serve Napoleon, and you ought to protect him. It is equally your duty. I come, therefore, to ask what has become of him. Villefort, by a strong effort, sought to control himself. "What is his name?" said he. "Tell me his name." "Edmond Dantès." Villefort would probably have rather stood the opposite muzzle of a pistol at 25 paces than have heard this name spoken, but he did not blench. "Dantès," repeated he. "Edmond Dantès." "Yes, monsieur." Villefort opened a large register, then went to a table. From the table turned to his registers, and then, turning to Morel, "Are you quite sure you are not mistaken, monsieur?" said he, in the most natural tone in the world. Had Morel been a more quick-sighted man, or better versed in these matters, he would have been surprised at the king's procureur answering him on such a subject, instead of referring him to the governors of the prison or the prefect of the department. But Morel, disappointed in his expectations of exciting fear, was conscious only of the other's condescension. Villefort had calculated rightly. "No," said Morel, "I am not mistaken. I have known him for 10 years, the last 4 of which he was in my service. Do not you recollect? I came about 6 weeks ago to plead for clemency, as I come to-day to plead for justice. You received me very coldly. Oh, the royalists were very severe with the Bonapartists in those days." "Monsieur," returned Villefort, "I was then a royalist, because I believed the Bourbons not only the heirs to the throne, but the chosen of the nation. The miraculous return of Napoleon has conquered me. The legitimate monarch is he who is loved by his people." "That's right," cried Morel. "I like to hear you speak thus, and I augur well for Edmond for him." "Wait a moment," said Villefort, turning over the leaves of a register. "I have it. A sailor who was about to marry a young Catalan girl. I recollect it now. It was a very serious charge." "How so?" "You know that when he left here he was taken to the Palais de Justice." "Well?" "I made my report to the authorities at Paris, and a week after he was carried off." "Carried off!" said Morel. "What can they have done with him?" "Oh, he has been taken to Fenestrelles, to Pignerol, or to the St. Margaret Islands. Some fine morning he will return to take command of your vessel." "Come when he will, it shall be kept for him. But how is it he is not already returned? It seems to me the first care of government should be to set at liberty those who have suffered for their adherence to it." "Do not be too hasty, Monsieur Morel," replied Villefort. "The order of imprisonment came from high authority, and the order for his liberation must proceed from the same source, and, as Napoleon has scarcely been reinstated a fortnight, the letters have not yet been forwarded." "But," said Morel, "is there no way of expediting all these formalities, of releasing him from arrest?" "There has been no arrest." "How?" "It is sometimes essential to government to cause a man's disappearance without leaving any traces, so that no written forms or documents may defeat their wishes." "It might be so under the Bourbons, but at present—" "It has always been so, my dear Morel, since the reign of Louis XIV. The Emperor is more strict in prison discipline than even Louis himself, and the number of prisoners whose names are not on the register is incalculable. Had Morel even any suspicions, so much kindness would have dispelled them." "Well, Monsieur de Villefort, how would you advise me to act?" asked he. "Petition the minister." "Oh, I know what that is. The minister receives 200 petitions every day, and does not read 3. "That is true, but he will read a petition countersigned and presented by me." "And will you undertake to deliver it?" "With the greatest pleasure. Dantès was then guilty, and now he is innocent, and it is as much my duty to free him as it was to condemn him. Villefort thus forestalled any danger of an inquiry, which, however improbable it might be, if it did take place, would leave him defenceless. "But how shall I address the minister?" "Sit down there," said Villefort, giving up his place to Morrel, "and write what I dictate." "Will you be so good?" "Certainly. But lose no time. We have lost too much already." "That is true. Only think what the poor fellow may even now be suffering." Villefort shuddered at the suggestion, but he had gone too far to draw back. Dantès must be crushed to gratify Villefort's ambition. Villefort dictated a petition in which, from an excellent intention no doubt, Dantès' patriotic services were exaggerated, and he was made out one of the most active agents of Napoleon's return. It was evident that at the sight of this document the minister would instantly release him. The petition finished, Villefort read it aloud. "That will do," said he. "Leave the rest to me." "Will the petition go soon?" "Today." "Countersigned by you?" "The best thing I can do will be to certify the truth of the contents of your petition." And, sitting down, Villefort wrote the certificate at the bottom. Dantès remained a prisoner, and heard not the noise of the fall of Louis XVIII's throne, or the still more tragic destruction of the empire. Twice during the 100 days had Morrel renewed his demand, and twice had Villefort soothed him with promises. At last there was Waterloo, and Morrel came no more. He had done all that was in his power, and any fresh attempt would only compromise him uselessly. Louis XVIII remounted the throne. Villefort, to whom Marseilles had become filled with remorseful memories, sought and obtained the situation of king's procureur at Toulouse, and a fortnight afterwards he married Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, whose father now stood higher at court than ever. And so Dantès, after the 100 days and after Waterloo, remained in his dungeon, forgotten of earth and heaven. Danglars comprehended the full extent of the wretched fate that overwhelmed Dantès, and when Napoleon returned to France, he, after the manner of mediocre minds, deemed the coincidence a degree of providence. But when Napoleon returned to Paris, Danglars' heart failed him, and he lived in constant fear of Dantès' return on a mission of vengeance. He therefore informed M. Morrel of his wish to quit the sea, and obtained a recommendation from him to a Spanish merchant, into whose service he entered at the end of March, that is, 10 or 12 days after Napoleon's return. He then left for Madrid, and was heard no more of. Fernand understood nothing except that Dantès was absent. What had become of him he cared not to inquire. Only, during the respite the absence of his rival afforded him, he reflected, partly on the means of deceiving Mercédès as to the cause of his absence, partly on plans of emigration and abduction, as from time to time he sat and motionless on the summit of Cape Pharo, at the spot from whence Marseilles and the Catalans are visible, watching for the apparition of a young and handsome man, who was for him also the messenger of vengeance. Fernand's mind was made up. He would shoot Dantès and then kill himself. But Fernand was mistaken. A man of his disposition never kills himself, for he constantly hopes. During this time the empire made its last conscription, and every man in France capable of bearing arms rushed to obey the summons of the emperor. Fernand departed with the rest, bearing with him the terrible thought that while he was away, his rival would perhaps return and marry Mercédès. Had Fernand really meant to kill himself, he would have done so when he parted from Mercédès. His devotion and the compassion he showed for her misfortunes produced the effect they always produce on noble minds. Mercédès had always had a sincere regard for Fernand, and this was now strengthened by gratitude. "My brother," said she, as she placed his knapsack on his shoulders, "be careful of yourself, for if you are killed, I shall be alone in this world." These words carried a ray of hope into Fernand's heart. Should Dantès not return, Mercédès might one day be his. Mercédès was left alone to face with the vast plain that had never seemed so barren, and the sea that had never seemed so vast. Bathed in tears, she wandered about the Catalan village. Sometimes she stood mute and motionless as a statue, looking towards Marseilles; at other times gazing on the sea, and debating as to whether it were not better to cast herself into the abyss of the ocean, and thus end her woes. It was not want of courage that prevented her putting this resolution into execution, but her religious feelings came to her aid and saved her. Caderousse was, like Fernand, enrolled in the army, but, being married and 8 years older, he was merely sent to the frontier. Old Dantès, who was only sustained by hope, lost all hope at Napoleon's downfall. 5 months after he had been separated from his son, and almost at the hour of his arrest, he bequeathed his last in Mercédès' arms. Monsieur Morel paid the expenses of his funeral, and a few small debts the old poor man had contracted. There was more than benevolence in this action, there was courage. The South was aflame, and to assist, even on his deathbed, the father of so dangerous a Bonapartist as Dantès was stigmatized as a crime. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14. The Two Prisoners. A year after Louis XVIII's restoration, a visit was made by the Inspector-General of Prisons. Dantès in his cell heard the noise of preparation. Sounds that at the depth where he lay would have been inaudible to any but the ear of a prisoner, who could hear the splash of the drop of water that every hour fell from the roof of his dungeon. He guessed something uncommon was passing among the living, but he had so long ceased to have any intercourse with the world that he looked upon himself as dead. The inspector visited, one after another, the cells and dungeons of several of the prisoners, whose good behaviour or stupidity recommended them to the clemency of the government. He inquired how they were fed, and if they had any request to make. The universal response was that the fare was detestable, and that they wanted to be set free. The inspector asked if they had anything else to ask for. They shook their heads. What could they desire beyond their liberty? The inspector turned smilingly to the governor. I do not know what reason government can assign for these useless visits. When you see one prisoner, you see all, always the same thing, ill-fed and innocent. Are there any others? Yes, the dangerous and mad prisoners are in the dungeons. Let us visit them then, said the inspector with an air of fatigue. We must play the farce to the end. Let us see the dungeons. Let us first send for 2 soldiers, said the governor. The prisoners sometimes, through mere uneasiness of life, and in order to be sentenced to death, commit acts of useless violence, and you might fall a victim. Take all needful precautions, replied the inspector. 2 soldiers were accordingly sent for, and the inspector descended a stairway, so foul, so humid, so dark, as to be loathsome to sight, smell, and respiration. Oh, cried the inspector, who can live here? A most dangerous conspirator, a man we are ordered to keep the most strict watch over, as he is daring and resolute. He is alone? Certainly. How long has he been there? Nearly a year. Was he placed here when he first arrived? No, not until he attempted to kill the turnkey, who took his food to him. To kill the turnkey? Yes, the very one who is lighting us. Is it not true, Antoine? Asked the governor. True enough, he wanted to kill me, returned the turnkey. He must be mad, said the inspector. He is worse than that. He is a devil, returned the turnkey. Shall I complain of him? Demanded the inspector. Oh no, it is useless. Besides, he is almost mad now, and in another year he will be quite so. So much the better for him. He will suffer less, said the inspector. He was, as this remark shows, a man full of philanthropy, and in every way fit for his office. You are right, sir, replied the governor, and this remark proves that you have deeply considered the subject. Now we have in a dungeon about 20 feet distant, and to which you descended by another stair, an abbé, formerly leader of a party in Italy, who has been here since 1811, and in 1813 he went mad, and the change is astonishing. He used to weep, he now laughs. He grew thin, he now grows fat. You had better see him, for his madness is amusing." "I will see them both," returned the inspector. "I must conscientiously perform my duty." This was the inspector's first visit. He wished to display his authority. "Let us visit this one first," added he. "By all means," replied the governor, and he signed to the turnkey to open the door. At the sound of the key turning in the lock, and the creaking of the hinges, Dantès, who was crouched in a corner of the dungeon, whence he could see the ray of light that came through a narrow iron grating above, raised his head. Seeing a stranger, escorted by two turnkeys, holding torches, and accompanied by two soldiers, and to whom the governor spoke bareheaded, Dantès, who guessed the truth, and that the moment to address himself to the superior authorities was come, sprung forward with clasped hands. The soldiers interposed their bayonets, for they thought that he was about to attack the inspector. And the latter recoiled 2 or 3 steps. Dantès saw that he was looked upon as dangerous. Then, infusing all the humility he possessed into his eyes and voice, he addressed the inspector, and sought to inspire him with pity. The inspector listened attentively, then, turning to the governor, observed, "He will become religious. He is already more gentle. He is afraid, and retreated before the bayonets. Madmen are not afraid of anything. I made some curious observations on this at Charenton." Then, turning to the prisoner, "What is it you want?" said he. "I want to know what crime I have committed, to be tried, and if I am guilty, to be shot, if innocent, to be set at liberty." "Are you well fed?" said the inspector. "I believe so. I don't know. It's of no consequence. What matters really, not only to me, but to officers of justice and the king, is that an innocent man should languish in prison, the victim of an infamous denunciation, to die here cursing his executioners." "You are very humble to-day," remarked the governor. "You are not always so. The other day, for instance, when you tried to kill the turnkey." "It is true, sir, and I beg his pardon, for he has always been very good to me, but I was mad." "Are you not so any longer?" "No, captivity has subdued me. I have been here so long." "So long? When were you arrested, then?" asked the inspector. "The 28th of February, 1815, at 2:30 in the afternoon." "To-day is the 30th of July, 1816. Why, it is but 17 months." "Only 17 months?" replied Dantès. "Oh, you do not know what is 17 months in prison. 17 ages, rather, especially to a man who, like me, had arrived at the summit of his ambition, to a man who, like me, was on the point of marrying a woman he adored, who saw an honourable career opened before him, and who loses all in an instant, who sees his prospects destroyed, and is ignorant of the fate of his affianced wife, and whether his aged father be living. 17 months' captivity to a sailor accustomed to the boundless ocean is a worse punishment than human crime ever merited. Have pity on me, then, and ask for me, not intelligence, but a trial, not pardon, but a verdict. A trial, sir, I only ask for that. That surely cannot be denied to one who is accused." "We shall see," said the inspector, turning to the governor. "On my word, the poor devil touches me. You must show me the proofs against him." "Certainly, but you will find terrible charges." "Monsieur," continued Dantès, "I know it is not in your power to release me, but you can plead for me. You can have me tried, and that is all I ask. Let me know my crime and the reason why I am condemned, Uncertainty is worse than all." "Go on with the lights," said the inspector. "Monsieur," cried Dantès, "I can tell by your voice you are touched with pity. Tell me at least a hope." "I cannot tell you that," replied the inspector. "I can only promise to examine into your case." "Oh, I am free! Then I am saved!" "Who arrested you?" "Monsieur Villefort. See him and hear what he says." "Monsieur Villefort is no longer at Marseilles. He is now at Toulouse." "I am no longer surprised at my detention," murmured Dantès, "since my only protector is removed." "Had Monsieur de Villefort any cause of personal dislike to you?" "None. On the contrary, he was very kind to me." "I can, then, rely on the notes he has left concerning you?" "Entirely." "That is well. Wait patiently, then." Dantès fell on his knees and prayed earnestly. The door closed, but this time a fresh inmate was left with Dantès. Hope. "Will you see the register at once?" asked the governor, "or proceed to the other cell?" "Let us visit them all," said the inspector. "If I once went up those stairs, I should never have the courage to come down again." "Ah, this one is not like the other, and his madness is less affecting than this one's display of reason." "What is his folly?" "He fancies he possesses an immense treasure. The first year he offered government 1,000,000 of francs for his release, the second 2, the third 3, and so on progressively. He is now in his 5th year of captivity. He will ask to speak to you in private, and offer you 5 millions." "How curious! What is his name?" "The Abbé Faria." "Number 27," said the inspector. "It is here. Unlock the door, Antoine." The turnkey obeyed, and the inspector gazed curiously into the chamber of the mad abbé. In the centre of the cell, in a circle traced with a fragment of plaster detached from the wall, sat a man whose tattered garments scarcely covered him. He was drawing in this circle geometrical lines, and seemed as much absorbed in his problem as Archimedes was when the soldier of Marcellus slew him. He did not move at the sound of the door, and continued his calculations until the flash of the torches lighted up with an unwonted glare the sombre walls of his cell. Then, raising his head, he perceived with astonishment the number of persons present. He hastily seized the coverlet of his bed and wrapped it round him. "What is it you want?" said the inspector. "I, monsieur?" replied the abbé with an air of surprise. "I want nothing." "You do not understand," continued the inspector. "I am sent here by government to visit the prison, and hear the requests of the prisoners." "Oh, that is different," cried the abbé, "and we shall understand each other, I hope." "There now," whispered the governor, "it is just as I told you." "Monsieur," continued the prisoner, "I am the Abbé Ferreri, born at Rome. I was for 20 years Cardinal Spade's secretary. I was arrested, why I know not, toward the beginning of the year 1811. Since then I have demanded my liberty from the Italian and French government." "Why from the French government?" "Because I was arrested at Piombino, and I presume that, like Milan and Florence, Piombino has become the capital of some French department." "Ah," said the inspector, "you have not heard the latest news from Italy?" "My information dates from the day on which I was arrested," returned the Abbé Ferrara, "and as the Emperor had created the kingdom of Rome for his infant son, I presume that he has realized the dream of Machiavelli and Caesar Borgia, which was to make Italy a united kingdom." "Monsieur," returned the inspector, "Providence has changed this gigantic plan you advocate so warmly. It is the only means of rendering Italy strong, happy, and independent." "Very possibly, only I am not come to discuss politics, but to inquire if you have anything to ask or to complain of." "The food is the same as in other prisons. That is very bad. The lodging is very unhealthful, but, on the whole, passable for a dungeon, and it is not that which I wish to speak of, but a secret I have to reveal of the greatest importance." "We are coming to the point," whispered the governor. "It is for that reason that I am delighted to see you," continued the abbé, "although you have disturbed me in a most important calculation, which, if it succeed, would possibly change Newton's system. Could you allow me a few words in private?" "What did I tell you?" said the governor. "You knew him," returned the inspector with a smile. "What you ask is impossible, monsieur," continued he, addressing Ferreri. "But," said the abbé, "I would speak to you of a large sum amounting to 5 millions." "The very sum you named," whispered the inspector in his turn. "However," continued Ferreri, seeing that the inspector was about to depart, "it is not absolutely necessary for us to be alone. The governor can be present." "Unfortunately," said the governor, "I know beforehand what you are about to say. It concerns your treasures, does it not?" Ferreri fixed his eyes on him with an expression that would have convinced any one else of his sanity. "Of course," said he. "Of what else should I speak?" "Mr. Inspector," continued the governor, "I can tell you the story as well as he, for it has been dined in my ears for the last 4 or 5 years." "That proves," returned the abbé, "that you are like those of Holy Writ, who having ears hear not, and having eyes see not." "My dear sir, the government is rich and does not want your treasures," replied the inspector. "Keep them until you are liberated." The abbé's eyes glistened. He seized the inspector's hand. "But what if I am not liberated?" cried he, "and am detained here until my death? This treasure will be lost. Had not government better profit by it? I will offer 6 millions, and I will content myself with the rest, if they will only give me my liberty." "On my word," said the inspector in a low tone, "had I not been told beforehand that this man was mad, I should believe what he says." "I am not mad," replied Ferreri, with the acuteness of hearing peculiar to prisoners. "The treasure I speak of really exists, and I offer to sign an agreement with you, in which I promise to lead you to the spot where you shall dig, and if I deceive you, bring me here again. I ask no more." The governor laughed. "Is the spot far from here?" 100 leagues. "It is not ill planned," said the governor. "If all the prisoners took it into their heads to travel 100 leagues, and their guardians consented to accompany them, they would have a capital chance of escaping." "The scheme is well known," said the inspector, "and the abbé's plan has not even the merit of originality." Then, turning to Ferreri, "I inquired if you were well fed," said he. "Swear to me," replied Ferreri, "to free me if what I tell you prove true, and I will stay here while you go to the spot." "Are you well fed?" repeated the inspector. "Monsieur, you run no risk, for, as I told you, I will stay here, so there is no chance of my escaping." "You do not reply to my question," replied the inspector impatiently. "Nor you to mine," cried the abbé. "You will not accept my gold. I will keep it for myself. You refuse me my liberty. God will give it me." And the abbé, casting away his coverlet, resumed his place and continued his calculations. "What is he doing there?" said the inspector. "Counting his treasures," replied the governor. Ferreri replied to this sarcasm with a glance of profound contempt. The turnkey closed the door behind them. "He was wealthy once, perhaps?" said the inspector. "Or dreamed he was, and awoke mad." "After all," said the inspector, "if he had been rich, he would not have been here." So the matter ended for the Abbé Ferreri. He remained in his cell, and this visit only increased the belief of his insanity. Caligula or Nero, those treasure seekers, those desirers of the impossible would have accorded to the poor wretch, in exchange for his wealth, the liberty he so earnestly prayed for. But the kings of modern times, restrained by the limits of mere probability, have neither courage nor desire. They fear the ear that hears their orders, and the eye that scrutinises their actions. Formerly they believed themselves sprung from Jupiter, and shielded by their birth, but nowadays they are not inviolable. It has always been against the policy of despotic governments to suffer the victims of their persecutions to reappear. As the Inquisition rarely allowed its victims to be seen with their limbs distorted and their flesh lacerated by torture, so madness is always concealed in its cell, from whence, should it depart, it is conveyed to some gloomy hospital, where the doctor has no thought for man or mind in the mutilated being the jailer delivers to him. The very madness of the Abbé Ferrari, gone mad in prison, condemned him to the perpetual captivity. The inspector kept his word with Dantès. He examined the register and found the following note concerning him: Edmond Dantès, violent Bonapartist, took an active part in the return from Elba. The greatest watchfulness and care to be exercised. This note was in a different hand from the rest, which showed that it had been added since his confinement. The inspector could not contend against this accusation. He simply wrote, "Nothing to be done." This visit had infused new vigour into Dantès. He had, till then, forgotten the date, but now, with a fragment of plaster, he wrote the date, 30th of July, 1816, and made a mark every day, in order not to lose his reckoning again. Days and weeks passed away, then months. Dantès still waited. He at first expected to be freed in a fortnight. This fortnight expired. He decided that the inspector would do nothing until his return to Paris, and that he would not reach there until his circuit was finished. He therefore fixed 3 months. 3 months passed away, then 6 more. Finally 10 months and a half had gone by, and no favourable change had taken place, and Dantès began to fancy the inspector's visit but a dream, an illusion of the brain. At the expiration of a year, the governor was transferred. He had obtained charge of the fortress at Ham. He took with him several of his subordinates, and amongst them Dantès' jailer. A new governor arrived. It would have been too tedious to acquire the names of the prisoners. He learned their numbers instead. This horrible place contained 50 cells. Their inhabitants were designated by the numbers of their cell, and the unhappy young man was no longer called Edmond Dantès. He was now number 34. Chapter 14.